I've already talked about how much I like Sonic Unleashed. I made a video that was arguably way too long going over it, because I genuinely felt like the game deserved it. Even with its flaws, Sonic Unleashed, it's always going to be a game that I'll praise. But that praise is for the HD version of the game, the one you're looking at right now, even though this isn't the first version of the game that I played. You see, I didn't own a 360 or PlayStation 3 back when Unleashed was released. All I had at the time was a Wii. And as you might expect, there was no way that this was going to run on a Wii. Even as it was having a rough time on the consoles it was being made for, which is exactly why a separate version of the game was made for the Wii and PlayStation 2. Believe it or not, I was actually a bit worried about revisiting this game. I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with having a game that you loved as a kid, only to revisit that game a few years later to find out that it's not nearly as good as you remember it. Luckily though, that's not exactly how things played out this time around. Well, okay, maybe a little bit, but you'll see what I mean. When the HD and SD versions of Unleashed are compared, there are numerous pros and cons thrown around for each version. There are the obvious comparisons, like the graphics looking much better in the HD version, but I found it interesting that at least I was under the impression that the Werehog stages were much shorter in the SD version, which is only true by a technicality. Because while the levels are shorter on average than the HD version, this is only because the SD version splits up the Werehog stages into multiple levels. So sure, they look shorter on paper, however there's at least 3 of these levels that you'll have to slog through, and they'll add up to be just about as long as the HD version. But maybe you're thinking this is still better. After all, segmenting levels like this means that you could take a break in between each one. And also, if you happen to get a game over, it isn't as big of a deal since the individual levels aren't as long. Maybe this would be the case if the Werehog wasn't so much less interesting to play in this version. The moveset is incredibly toned down, and there's barely any variations in combos that you can perform. This leads to most fights consisting of you doing the same 2 combos over and over. This same thing was actually a big problem that people had with the HD version. But in that case, I'd call that issue self-imposed, since there are tons of combos you can unlock to spice up combat and defeat enemies quicker. However, in the SD version, I'd say the combat leaves a lot to be desired. It's still serviceable, and there's some kind of interesting things you can do, but they're not expanded on. Like, aerial combat technically exists, but it's so bare bones in this version that I tend to not bother. And unfortunately, the platforming doesn't really make up for it. Even if I think it's decent, I find it much more interesting in the HD counterpart thanks to better movement options, and also generally more engaging gameplay. It's a shame to say, but yeah, I see the SD Werehog as being a downgrade in just about every way. And I'm guessing that some of you are thinking, well, it's a downgraded version of another game, of course it's going to be worse in just about every way. But no, it doesn't have to be. In fact, actually, I think I might have the perfect example to show you what I mean. What a surprise, someone who enjoys the daytime levels more than the nighttime ones. Controversial opinion, I know, but at least let me explain. You see, the daytime levels in the HD version of Unleashed are incredible. It can't be overstated how good I think those levels are. Because of this, the SD version had a lot to compete with, but you know what? I think it does a pretty good job. Even though this gameplay might look very similar side by side, they control quite differently. They both hold a boost, however here, the boost is continuous. So long as you're holding down the appropriate button, you'll be boosting. Then when looking over here, the boost is instead activated by a press of a button, and upon activating it, you'll get a 2-second long burst of speed that feels much harder to steer. This combined with the different mechanics, physics, and level design, and you have 2 gameplay styles that are both similar and very different at the same time. At a base level, or when you're starting off, it's likely that this version will feel clunky. Turning any corner will feel awkward, boosting feels almost uncontrollable, and it's also likely that you'll have moments where it feels like you're fighting the stage when all you're trying to do is move forward. It's only as you begin to play the levels more and get more used to the controls that you start seeing the real potential for them. There is a heavy emphasis on movement, and maybe you're thinking that's obvious, but I don't think that the HD version compares in that department. In that version, I'd say the difficulty comes from reacting to the incoming obstacles and alternate routes, the majority of which are reflex-based, where you have to press the right button at the right time. General movement, however, is pretty straightforward. Sure, you can get better at it, but I'd say it's easy enough to get the hang of. That's one of the biggest things that separates these two versions, because here, general movement isn't straightforward. Well, I guess it is, but it's much harder to get the hang of. There's multiple reasons for this, but I'd mainly chalk it down to there being much less automation to help you steer, and also because of the boost. I mentioned how this functions already. You activate it by using one bar of your boost gauge, and it propels you forward almost uncontrollably for a whole 2 seconds. Now naturally, in these stages you're trying to go as fast as you can and reach the goal as fast as possible. And to accomplish that, well, you have to use your boost. And that's where the gameplay becomes interesting. Because the boost in this version of the game actively works against you. It gives you speed, sure, but it can feel like it's trying to mess you up in the process. Here's to hoping you don't miss the simple act of turning left and right. And if you're boosting, the walls become your enemy. Touching the side of one cancels the boost, and hitting one directly? Well... On top of all this, you also have to be very aware of your boost management. It's essential to know how often you'll be able to boost, and what ways you can go about getting more of it as you run through the level. I'm sure all of this information makes the boost seem like a bit more of a hindrance than anything, but it's really not. Its learning curve and skill ceiling I think only add to how engaging it is as a mechanic. And it's also not as uncontrollable as a lot of people seem to think. Did you know that you can actually stop it at any point by just tapping back on the control stick? That's something the game doesn't tell you. Also, that problem that the boost has with turning left and right? Yeah, that problem is fixed if you incorporate drifting into your boosts. A method that works wonders on helping improve the overall feel of this game. Not to mention tons of other small tricks you can learn. And sure, they might only save a second or two, but I don't think that makes them any less cool to pull off in your runs. My favorite tricks are the ones that break the intended way of traversing through a stage. Like here, where the intended path is a homing attack chain to get across the gap. You can't do a simple jump and boost to get across faster, but if you time it so that your boost runs out in the middle of your jump, then you can do a second boost to clear it without having to homing attack any enemy. You can also take this section as an example. Once again, the game wants you to perform a homing attack chain so that you can get to your desired route. But with some good timing and positioning, you can bounce off of an enemy as it rises and go through this section much faster than you would have otherwise. I'm not exaggerating when I say that there are tons of these small optimizations that you can utilize on your runs, where you aren't necessarily breaking the level design, but you're definitely not doing it the intended way. And whether this kind of level design was intentional or not, the amount of shortcuts you can find in these stages plays a big part in what makes them so good. At least, that's what I think. However, outside of the speedrunning aspect, if you were to just play through these stages normally, I don't think they're nearly as impressive. Like I said earlier, controls sometimes feel a bit clunky, and when you combine that with the sometimes unforgiving level design, I can definitely see why this version doesn't get more praise. But I really think that it should. Even if the gameplay style isn't anything to write home about at its basic level, the amount of depth it has to offer I think makes it more than worth it to replay these stages and also learn some new tricks that you can pull off along the way. As much as I'd like to keep talking about the day stages, I think what I have talked about serves as a good overview of what they are and why I like them so much. But even outside of these levels being great, there's plenty of other changes made in this version of Unleashed that I'm sure a lot of people might appreciate. For example, aside from the Werehog, the biggest problem that most people had with the HD version of the game was its forced medal collecting. The fact that you needed a certain amount of both sun and moon medals just to progress through the story, and that it's extremely likely you'll have to backtrack and look for them at least once. This problem isn't present in the SD version though, thanks to sun and moon medals being completely optional collectibles you get rewarded based on your rank at the end of stages. You can then use them to unlock all kinds of collectibles and even permanent upgrades to your life counter, but of course none of this is necessary. I'd say that for the most part this is a great change because I don't think that the medal collecting was a mechanic that should ever have been forced upon the player. But them only being rewarded at the end of stages counteractively introduced another issue for me, and that all rests with the Werehog again. You see, I actually quite enjoyed the medal collecting in these stages because they openly encouraged exploration for you to have a look around. If they're removed, then there is much less incentive to explore. The new collectibles added as a pseudo replacement to the medals don't really do it for me. There's less of them, and their placement makes them much less interesting to collect. I still think though that overall the changes made to the medal system were a really good idea. I just wish that they were kept as collectibles within the Werehog stages, but maybe that's just me who thinks that. There's lots of other small changes from both versions, both good and bad depending on your preference. There's the removal of some things, other things are simplified, and then there's the rare new edition. Maybe I should be going more into detail about these changes between the versions, but for the most part I think that the differences are pretty minor. And yeah, I would call a lot of the changes downgrades, but it's to be expected for the console that this version was being made for. And still, the daytime stages were incredible to revisit. I spent a lot of time talking about them for good reason. I was actually pretty surprised on how good they ended up being. I definitely don't see them as a downgrade. In fact, if anything, I think they stand really well on their own. Dimps did a really good job designing these daytime stages. And actually, while I'm on that point, there seems to be a common misconception that Dimps were responsible for making this version of the game, but that's not the case. Dimps only created the level design for the daytime stages, while Sonic Team handled everything else about the game. But that is me getting off topic. I'm supposed to be closing out the video. So yeah, what did you think of it? If you enjoyed it, a like is always appreciated since it helps the channel grow, and if you enjoy content like this, then maybe consider subscribing. It still doesn't feel natural to ask for these things, but I'm a pretty small channel, so I'll take whatever help I can get. Anyway, this is the end of the video, so thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.